welcome to this videocast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, I'm going to talk today about a piece of land occupied, at least in 2013, be less now, by 22 million people. A piece of land that is little bigger than North Dakota. And I'm talking, of course, about Syria. Now, in that country of less than 22 million people now, and little bigger than the size of North Dakota, I'd like to make a list. We have America bombing, France bombing, Turkey bombing, Israel bombing, Kurds attacking, US backed, armed and trained rebels bombing and attacking. We have ISIS bombing and attacking. We have Iran having a military presence there. And now we have Russia starting to bomb that land this week. Very much in the not too distant background is China. And of course we have the psychopath that is David Cameron, absolutely desperate to get the British Air Force involved also in bombing this land. If anyone ever needed confirmation, and of course we don't, that we live in a lunatic asylum, then the events of Syria are the confirmation. Does anyone really think that all this is going on? All these countries involved, all this bombing, all this death, destruction, suffering, and refugee creation is happening because the West morally feels that President Assad is a tyrant oppressing his people, and therefore the opposition to him in the country must be supported. Does anyone really believe that? The idea that the United States and Britain alone have any interest whatsoever in the oppression of people, when the British Empire and the American Empire, that is but not named, have spent centuries oppressing people all over the world for their own economic benefit and accumulation of power. They could not give a damn about what is happening in Syria in terms of oppression of the people or whatever else they claim. We have a situation where one of the greatest oppressors of humanity on the planet, Saudi Arabia, which executes someone on average about every 2 days at the moment, is part of the coalition to stop oppression in Syria. We have ISIS rightly vilified and condemned for the horrors of beheading as a tool of trauma and control and terror. And yet, we have Saudi Arabia beheading with not a murmur from the same moral West. They are bombing mercilessly civilians in Yemen without a murmur from the moral West that arms them and allows them to do it. So, it's pretty bloody clear that the cover story of "We must help the people of Syria" is a load of fricking bollocks. So there's another reason, which I'm going to come to in this videocast, and there are many levels to it. I am sick beyond words at the moral hypocrisy of the Obamas and the Camerons and the Blairs and the Bushes and all these others, the Hollands and the Sarkozys, war criminals, the lot of them, psychopaths, who talk about how they must stand for freedom and justice while bombing the crap out of country after country and leaving mayhem and violence behind them. We have a moral United States that has held a British citizen, Shaka Arma, in Guantanamo Bay for 13 years without charge or trial, an innocent man taken from his family and his children, a man denied seeing his children grow up, has a child he's not even seen because he was born after he was taken into captivity by these psychopaths. We have children, his children, who've been denied a father in their childhood by a nation, a government representing a nation, more like it, and even more so, a hidden hand behind governments, whichever the complexion, that are driving this horrific treatment of people. We have an American administration, under whatever colour, that can do that to a human being and still claim the moral high ground. So we have the next stage this week of the Syrian crisis, and that is the introduction of Russia as a bomber. Must have more bombs. Cameron must come in and have more bombs, because bombs sort everything, don't they? And it's a very, very dangerous situation on a much bigger level, as I'll come to in this videocast. Because on this piece of land called Syria, we now have lining up Russia with China in the background, but not far in the background, like I say, and Iran against the American, British, French led West, with Israel, the elephant in the living room, behind them. And obviously, President Putin has gone in there to protect the Assad government. Not just to do that, but to protect Russian military and naval interests in Syria from the gathering chaos, upheaval, and takeover. And when the first strikes, anyway, were against what people are not calling ISIS, but opponents of the Assad government, well, that all makes sense because Russia well know, and it's becoming more and more accepted, the initial um, trigger that brought about this whole catastrophe was through American trained, armed, and funded rebels, many of which had just been shipped over from doing the same in Libya. And so what we have now, in effect, is a emerging proxy war on that land between definitely Russia, supported by China and Iran, who are attacking American backed rebels. And I love them. I love them. They call them moderates. There is no moderation in what any of them are doing in Syria. And it could go any way. But I am going to talk later about something that was predicted a long time ago, which current events are absolutely mirroring decades later. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. We had the United States Defense Secretary, Ashton Carter, saying this week that Russia's intervention in Syria was pouring fuel, petrol, on the fire. Well, first of all, it's a fire that the United States began systematically. And secondly, the United States has been, and Britain, has been pouring petrol on fires all over the world for hundreds of years. See, what's happening now is only a continuation of what has happened for so long. The British Empire used force to go into countries and take them over. And they called it the Great British Empire. There was only one thing great about it, and that was the size of it. And all America are doing, in league with Britain again, is the same. Going into countries, taking them over for their own benefit. But there's another picture behind that. Because even in the alternative media, they can take a certain level of this and see it in a certain way. But you've got to get deeper in the rabbit hole to see what's really going on. Because if you take Putin and Obama and Cameron and Hollande and all these people to be calling the shots, to be the ones that are making all the decisions, that are orchestrating everything, Putin too, then there's much of it, or much of the plot, that's being missed. Because there is a hidden hand, which I've exposed at great length in my books, which has a global network and networks within each country in a structure that operates like a multinational corporation. You have the headquarters, in this case, the center of the web. And then you have the subsidiary webs or parts of the web in different countries that we call the United States, Britain, France, Russia. And these presidents like Obama and prime ministers like Cameron and Putin, they come into prominence, and that's what we see. And when we see them, we say he's in control, he's in control, he's in control, he's running the country, but he's not, because the next election or whenever he goes at some point, they'll disappear, and another group of people will come up, and they'll be perceived to be in control of events, but they're not, because the hidden hand is there, whoever the puppets are at the time. And it's the hidden hand that is driving this. And so if you look at Syria, it can be seen on one level as Putin coming in to respond to what's happening to what the United States is doing, Britain's doing in Syria. And on that level, that's true. That is what's happening. But if you go deeper, then what appears to be one thing can actually be another. And that brings me to the infamous and much discussed and often dismissed letter from Albert Pike in 1871. It's when he is said to have sent a letter to a man called Giuseppe Mazzini, one of the founders of the mafia, and absolutely involved in this whole web that I'm talking about. You know, for people who haven't come across Albert Pike, he was a Freemasonic hero in the United States. He was the supreme pontiff of universal Freemasonry in the 19th century, one of the inspirations for the Ku Klux Klan. Nice man. And he is supposed to have written this letter to Mazzini in 1871, detailing 3 world wars that were coming, that this network was going to manipulate, that would change the face of human society. And the letter was claimed to exist by a man called William James Guy Carr, who's an English-born Canadian naval officer, who wrote a book and wrote about the content of this letter. The book was written in 1959, and it was called Satan, Prince of the World. Now, the first 2 world wars were accurately described in what Carr said was in the letter. But of course, he revealed the contents in 1959, so that don't really make a lot of difference, really. But the Third World War, predicted in this letter, according to Carr, had not happened, and is still not yet happened. But it's interesting to look at events in Syria from the background of what was said, or allegedly said, by Albert Pike in 1871, talking about the Third World War. This is what he said. The Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agenteur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and political Zionism, the State of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on the issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, spiritual, and economical exhaustion. We shall unleash the nihilists and atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm, which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations of the world the absolute effect, the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere, the letter says, the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude disillusioned with Christianity, whose Deciasic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. Now, there's a few things to this. First of all, the letter in 1871 mentions Zionism. So, of course, people immediately dismiss that and say, well, there was no Zionism. Well, the knowledge that Zionism was coming was well known by 1871 within the network. In fact, Zionism publicly manifested itself before the end of that century. So it's something that I've been emphasizing year after year after year after year, decade after decade. This global unfolding plan for humanity is not made up on the hoof, and it's not made up a few days, weeks, months, or even years in advance. It's put in place way back and then played out like dominoes falling, knocking over the next thing, knocking over the next thing. So, for instance, you have the Syrian situation and the North African and Middle East situation knocking the next domino out, which I've spoken about in a recent videocast, which is mass migration into Europe. And he talks there, Pike, about nihilists, unleashing nihilists to create mayhem. Well, nihilism is described and defined like this: a political belief or action that advocates or commits violence or terrorism without discernible constructive goals. Well, is there a better description out there of ISIS and what it's doing? I watched a film report the other night from inside ISIS and what they were doing to children. They had people telling their stories who'd been in the ISIS fold and then had gotten out into Turkey. And they are taking kids from the earliest age and they're indoctrinating them in the most merciless way, programming them to believe that anyone who is not in ISIS is an infidel who must be killed, making them witness killings, and even making them do the killing, telling them that they must at all times listen and obey, never question, and if you do question, then you get killed or mutilated. There was one young boy who had refused to join ISIS, refused to be indoctrinated, and they cut off his hand and they cut off his foot. Now, this level of sheer super psychopathic evil is the very mentality of the force behind all this in the shadows that I've been exposing all these years. And when you look at ISIS, you are looking at the blueprint for the world they want everywhere. So the whole theme of nihilism, unleashing nihilism on the world, fits what is happening with ISIS. And then you look, and I'll keep it brief because I've said this before in these videocasts. Then you look at the run-up to this, like I said earlier, this is nothing to do with the Syrian people. It's nothing really to do with Assad, except that he's in their way, so he's got to go. It could have been someone else in their way, and he'd have to go. When you take it back, you can go back to September 2000 and the Project for the New American Century think tank document listing a series of countries in the Middle East and North Africa that they wanted to take out and take over. You look at what General Wesley Clark said, former Supreme Commander in NATO, who said that immediately after 9/11 he was told that there were this list of countries they were going to take over and invade, and they were the same countries the Project for the New American Century in September 2000 had talked about. And the document in September 2000 had said we need another Pearl Harbor to trigger this process of taking over these countries. And of course, we had 9/11, which is blatantly an inside job for the specific reason of triggering this so-called war on terror, which has led us to where we are now. So they go into Afghanistan, they go into Iraq, they go into Libya, now they go into Syria. Also on the list is Iran, also on the list is Lebanon, which is being crushed by the influx of refugees from Syria into what is a very small country. And so you are seeing this unfold before your eyes. So what's happening in Syria is merely an attempt that's actually become log-jammed because of Assad's resistance to take over Syria in line with the list. And notice this: while this list of countries has been unfolding in terms of either direct invasion or invasion via funding, arming, and training rebels, we have had a series of presidents and a series of prime ministers. In America, we started off with Bush after the Project for the New American Century document was published, and the people behind it, the Bushes, the Cheneys, the Zackheims, and all these people, the Rumsfelds, they came to power in the Bush administration to carry out what was in their document. So we had a right-wing Republican that started it off. And then we moved, after two periods in office of that idiot, we had Obama, who appeared to be completely the opposite, claimed he was the opposite, Mr. Change, Democrat. He comes in, and in his 2 terms, that list has continued to be ticked off. In Britain, we've had Blair, started off with Bush, ticking off the list. And we went briefly through his colleague, Gordon Brown, to David Cameron today. David Cameron is in the Conservative Party, which is different to Blair's Labour Party. But when Cameron came in, the list continued to be ticked off, just as it was with Blair and Bush. In France, you had Sarkozy ticking off the list with Britain and America. And then in came his opponent, Hollande, and the list has continued to be ticked off. It is so blatant, you would think a moron could see it. But the media keep reporting the story according to Western propaganda. I had to smile this week when the Russian bombing in Syria began. And they said, oh no, we targeted ISIS targets. And the BBC reported this, and they say that they bombed ISIS targets, but this cannot be independently verified. Now that's fair enough. That's what journalists should do. That's what journalists should say. But through all this period of ticking off the list right to present day, when America says we did this, when Britain says we did this, then it's accepted they did this. There's no, oh, but we don't have independent verification. Because the media is not just not independent in terms of who owns it, it's not independent in the way that it treats different countries. It's almost like you watch a football program, like the England team are playing or whatever, and the commentators and everyone in the program is kind of hoping England will and win and supporting England, right? Well, that's how the journalists are working with these wars. Yeah, they must be telling the truth. They're government of our country, but them, oh no, they can't be telling the truth. We have no verification, and so you've got this propaganda bias, which is also driving this ticking off of the list. And behind it, there is the elephant on the sofa, Israel. Those that wrote the project for the New American Century document were all Zionists, all of them. They were either born Zionists or they were supporters of Zionism, because it's a political movement, it's not a race. And there's Israel sitting there, that little sliver of land. You know, it's only the size of New Jersey, which is the 47th in size state in America. Got about 8 million people, sliver of land, and it is creating mayhem. Why? Because it is simply a fiefdom of the House of Rothschild. And as the House of Rothschild controls America and controls Britain and controls Israel, Israel gets what it bloody well likes and can do what it likes, whereas other countries will be condemned for doing a fraction of what it does. So you've had this Zionist project for the New American Century document in September 2000, listing these countries all around Israel, and they go on ticking them off while Israel is in the background goes, it's not me, we're not doing anything. And yet they are treating ISIS fighters in Israel when they get injured. They're bombing Syrian targets. And there is this concept they have of the Greater Israel. And the Greater Israel is to expand Israel from the Nile in Egypt across to the Euphrates in Iraq. And when you look at all that area, that land that would be included in that Greater Israel, it's all the land being affected now by what is going on, including Syria, Lebanon. And it's the land that's being emptied of people increasingly as a result of what's going on. And, you know, that piece of land, Israel, the size of New Jersey, has one of the best equipped militaries in the world, thanks to the United States, just as Saudi Arabia, thanks to the United States. It also has a nuclear arsenal, and it has that, had that for decades and decades. But while Israel and the United States have been going on and on and on for year after year and year after year about Iran and how it's a nuclear danger to the world, doesn't even have a nuclear weapon, America not only says nothing about the Israel nuclear arsenal, that it well knows, of course, it has, there is actually an official agreement that was reinforced when Obama came to power that says Israel won't talk about its nuclear arsenal, and America won't ask. Israel refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because in doing so, it would have to admit that it had a nuclear arsenal. And where I'm going with this is this. There is no way in the world that Israel has the military and nuclear capability that it has just to defend Israel. No way. It's been built up for another reason. And when you see events unfold in the Middle East now and in Syria, you can maybe ponder on why that has been assembled for a land so small and a population of 8 million people. So, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. Well, we certainly do. Not an interesting type of interesting I wish was happening, but it is. And we need to understand it. Otherwise, we go on being played like a stringed instrument. This is an article this week by a guy called Sean Stinson from the AIM network. And it's about the attitudes to all this in Australia. And the headline is Julie Bishop's Epiphany on the Road to Damascus. Julie Bishop is the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Australia. And the article says, it comes as welcome news that Australia is set to abandon its opposition to Bashar al-Assad as part of a durable peace settlement in Syria. The recent military escalation by Russia and reported sightings of Chinese warships in the Mediterranean in the last week must come as something of an embarrassment to the war hawks in Washington, and the knives may well be out for whichever rookie secretary forgot to register the war on terror as a trademark. Still, this has done little to change the tripartisan rhetoric coming out of Canberra. I don't, said this lady, for a moment shy away from the comments that we have made in the past about the illegitimacy of the regime. Who are you to decide the legitimacy of a regime? That's down to the people of Syria. The vast majority in polls that have been conducted support Assad being in power, not least because he's the only form, whatever people think of him, of any kind of stability at the moment. And they look at what it was before this started, and they look at what it is now, and would they like to go back to how it was? Are you kidding? President Assad unleashed chemical weapons on his own people, and the death and destruction in Syria is appalling and at unprecedented levels, Miss Bishop recently said in an address to the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Well, first of all, there is no evidence whatsoever that Assad was responsible for chemical weapons being used in Syria. There is lots of evidence that they were used by rebels, which the West then were able to blame on Assad as an effort to try to get political and public support to directly bomb the Assad regime. They couldn't do it. So they're indirectly bombing the Assad regime by saying we're bombing ISIS. These people say, I mean, I've heard it this week from the American ambassador to Britain. They're saying that all this mayhem is caused by President Assad. He was the one that started it all. When it was rebels funded, armed and trained by America that started it all. The mendacity of these people is extraordinary. That not just the lying, but the way it's delivered in this moral high ground way. It's extraordinary. These people are bonkers. The article goes on, in hearing these remarks, I can't help be reminded of the outrageous claims and bold-faced lies which led to the war in Iraq in 2003. Whatever happened to all those weapons of mass destruction, exactly, which Saddam was stockpiling? Was he able to secretly shield them from UN weapons inspectors with an invisibility cloak? Perhaps the same cloak that Dr. Assad is using to hide his chemical weapons arsenal, which official chemical weapons inspectors said was dealt with long ago and no longer existed, but he somehow still uses it. What? Or the one that Iran is evidently using to conceal its uranium enrichment program. Yeah, these invisibility cloaks, you can't trust them. Not to put a too fine a point on it, he says, but when the leading, one of the cheerleaders calling for the removal of the legitimate government of a sovereign nation state, which currently enjoys 80% of its support of its people, is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, then you might wonder if we're being told the whole truth. Now, the executive director of Human Rights Watch that he's talking about, Human Rights Watch, which is calling for the removal of Assad and the overthrow of Assad, and obviously would have to be violently, is a guy called Kenneth Roth. Now, I mean, don't laugh because it's serious. He said that he was drawn to human rights because of his ties to the CIA. He's also got ties to George Soros. And George Soros, this Rothschild billionaire frontman, is one of the prime players, or in many ways the prime player at organizational level, in the so-called Arab Spring, which of course is how all this started. The spontaneous uprising against Assad in Syria was supposed to be part of the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia and went into Egypt. Worked in Egypt, didn't it? Military dictatorship there now. And Soros has a series of trusts and organizations that specialize in training people for people's revolutions, not for the benefit of the people, but to use the people's revolution to overthrow regimes they want rid of. Because if you keep directly invading, as in Afghanistan and in Iraq, then people, might lift their heads up from the sport and the soap and say, what's going on? So you have to do it in different ways. The end's the same, the means can be different. And so the Arab Spring was nothing about freedom for Arabs. It was about removing regimes, secular Arab regimes, and putting the people under the jackboot of a grotesque tyranny, which is what is happening. So the article goes on, having taken part now, the writer says, having taken part in what now seems like an age ago in the rallies against the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the biggest protests Australia had seen since the Vietnam War, I'm more than a little miffed at the lack of public outrage at Australia's compliance in 2015. Perhaps the media is doing a better job of selling lies and deception this time around, but so far I remain unconvinced. But this is the point, where's the anti-war movement in America? Where was it once Obama came in? There it was when Bush was doing what he did, but when Obama came in to continue that anti-war movement, where are you? I want to see it. And then you had the situation in Britain, and he points out there in Australia, where this uprising and this determination to oppose these wars at one point is now basically dissipated. And it comes down to this. They say every Christmas, don't buy your children puppies, because they use this line, a puppy is not for Christmas, it's for life. Well, challenging tyranny is not for one moment. It's for life. oh, drop my glasses. And most people don't follow that at all. They get bored with it. They get tired of it. Oh, we've tried. We have to keep going. Because what's the alternative? That if you don't keep going and keep challenging what's going on, then it just goes on, not just the same, but gets worse. I'm tired, he says, of the blatant propaganda surrounding this illegal war. I'm tired of the persistent references to civil war in a country which is clearly being attacked by outside forces. That's another thing. The media, they pick up from the officials and the governments and institutions. It's a civil war. It's a civil war. No, it's not. It's a war that was started by American insurgents called rebels. I'm tired of hearing, he says, the government of Syria constantly referred to as the Assad regime. This is very significant, the use of words, because words are mind control devices if you use them in the right way. So you have labels. Hitler talked about keep your propaganda real simple so that everyone can understand it. So you need, it's like a football team. You are Manchester United, you are Arsenal, you are Miami Dolphins, you are San Francisco 49ers. Definite, no shades of grey. There's you, and you're different. And I support you, and I don't support you. I want you to win, I want you to lose. And so you label groups very simply. What they've done is demonize the word regime. If you look at the definition of regime, there's a regime in the United States, there's a regime in Britain, but no, regime has been manipulated to get an instant reaction from people as bad, tyrannical. It's a regime. And then anyone fighting the regime, however horrific they are, however outrageous their behavior, however violent they are, they're called moderates or moderate rebels. Now, often they're just as bad or worse than that which they are, or the regime that they're fighting. But don't matter. It's all a mind game. Regime, bad. Moderate rebels, good. And so it goes on. This is, and people pick up on this, and not everybody, almost no one watching this video, I would expect, but public in general, they pick up on this. And the media pick up on this because the media love to keep it simple. No shades of grey. Good guy, bad guy. Regime, moderates. Watch any BBC News bulletin talking about what's going on in the Middle East. It's pathetic. It's like children. It's like watching children. In fact, one of them reads the news like a primary school teacher, which sums it up really. Now, children, British public, I'm going to tell you a story. There was this regime, and they were very bad. It was a very bad, it was a big bag giant regime. And then there was this nice good little boy. He was a moderate rebel. Not much different to that, really. It really isn't. It really isn't. And he goes on talking about Cameron referring to Assad as a butcher. Again, he's a butcher. It's the reaction, ooh, we'll get rid of him. Cameron's the man who argued for and sanctioned the bombing of Libya that killed and maimed untold numbers of civilians on the pretext of protecting them from violence. And now he's so desperate to send British planes into Syria. Says Washington's war hawks have bypassed congressional appropriations by directing their client state Saudi Arabia, here we go, to deploy radical anti-Syrian and often anti-US militants against Assad, unleashing a wave of terror in the region. The reason Saudi Arabia, like Israel, can do what it bloody likes without condemnation is because they are playing their part in advancing the agenda, which they're all committed to. Um, and It says that the United States Secretary of State John Kerry and the late King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia were in conclusion with Wall Street insiders to contrive to control the entire region's oil and gas reserves and to weaken Russia and Iran by selling cheap oil to China. It says there's Israel involved, a newly created US-backed militarized rogue state whose original British colonial design includes not just the annexation of both the West Bank and Gaza, but of all the land, here we go, I mentioned earlier, from the Nile to the Euphrates, including parts of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Sinai, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. The plan for Greater Israel involves the balkanization of Arab states, beginning with Iraq, which is to be divided into Shia and Sunni territories and separate Kurdish state. See, this is a plan and it's unfolding. And if the public don't know the plan, they don't realize it's unfolding. They think it's all random. Then you also mention of Israel here. If you were an extreme, radical Islamic organization that ISIS claims to be, it's not, it's just fascist thugs. Where would you head first once you've assembled your army and assembled your firepower, courtesy of America? You would head for Israel, the infidels, to so many in the Middle East, the ultimate infidels. Or you'd head to the West. But no. Israel, amid all this, has been left alone. And where ISIS has gone, this Islamic organization, is into secular Arab countries to remove the regimes and take them over. Why not Israel? Because Israel is part of what's behind ISIS. But there may well come a point when Israel is attacked on purpose, because that will then give them the excuse to use this vast arsenal of weaponry that I mentioned earlier. It says there's China involved, an emerging superpower now lumbered with a stalling economy and forced to choose between a ready supply of cheap oil and the prospect of a war in Syria, spilling into Iran, southern Russia, and eventually breaching its own western borders. One of the things that was in that document, that project for the New American Century document in September 2000, was a call for regime change in China. It's all unfolding before our eyes. There's Germany, which seemed to have embraced the prospect of close to 1 million new low-paid workers with the same enthusiasm with which it welcomed the surge of cheap, skilled labour at the close of the Soviet era, an attitude perfectly consistent with EU ambitions to enforce human misery through austerity. But like I mentioned earlier, there are changing attitudes now in Germany. I think I mentioned it earlier, I do too much talking. We saw the welcome that in the news footage that the migrants and refugees got in Germany when they poured in recent weeks. But clearly now, from reports in Germany, that's changing because the numbers are just so overwhelming. And even members of our own party, Chancellor Merkel's own party, are saying, what's she doing? Just allowing all this and embracing all this when we can't cope. Well, Chancellor Merkel is absolutely welded to this hidden hand that I'm talking about. And thus what she's doing, as I talked in a recent videocast, she's just pushing this whole next stage involving Europe of pouring people from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe to completely change the culture, break down the sense of nationhood so that nation states can be dissolved and taken over completely. And think about it. What is a nation in Europe that has a bigger self-identity of being itself, of being its country, of being its culture. Germany. That's why Germany's being targeted more than any other country. It's because that's got the fiercest sense of self-identity, which they want to break down so they can absorb it into the greater whole. And then he says that there's the endless hordes now beating a path to Europe in what's being called the biggest mass movement of refugees since World War II. It's not just the Alawites, he says, and the Yazidis and other religious and ethnic minorities once protected under Syria's Assad regime, who now face a grim future, but the entire Syrian population, of whom more than half are now internally displaced or have fled in fear for their lives. Pray tell what conceivable form of regime change would ever allow these people to return to their homes. That's not the idea, as we've been talking about. Syria was and is the last secular nation in the Middle East, and so has been argued by many, not least President Putin himself. It is for the people of Syria and nobody else to decide who will govern them. Russia is now working in concert with Iran, Hezbollah from Lebanon, another one on the Project the New American Century list, and other regional partners to end the horror brought to bear by Washington's incessant meddling, while Obama still condemns Russia's strategy as doomed to failure. God dear, kettle and teapot or what? And continues to demand Assad's ultimate resignation. This outcome looks increasingly less likely. While China's last-minute arrival is obviously a game changer, it's not like the US were never invited to the party, he says. Putin's attempts to forge an alliance of nations to deal with the growing threat of global terror have never specifically excluded US participation. But with the US demonstrably the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism, it does make things a little awkward. As well as Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah and the Syrian Arab Army, the new coalition looks likely to include all members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, that's Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. This poses an obvious question right off the bat. Is Washington really afraid that Russia's intervention will make matters worse in Syria, or rather that putting an end to ISIS once and for all might render the US irrelevant? So what you're seeing again, you've got this collective treaty organization around Russia, which includes these countries. And then you've got NATO, and you're starting to see this division starting to appear, this multi-nation division, China involved as well. And there you've got this powder keg in Syria where they're all getting involved. What emerges from this picture, the writer says, is a strong sense that Washington's war hawks are losing or have lost their grip over Middle East politics. But if you go to a higher level, I'm talking earlier with the Pike letter, well, that's only one level of it. The Iranian moderates who are inclined to cooperate with the West for economic reasons are naturally allied to Russia, where the Syrian threat, ISIS threat, is concerned. And he finishes off, could the battle for Syria prove a victory for peace and diplomacy in an increasingly multipolar world, or is this how World War III begins? Well, we shall see, but events are certainly unfolding in the way the plan of decades and beyond, well beyond decades, set out to make happen. Another article I picked up here, it's from 2011, ever so relevant to what's happening in Syria. It's headed, Who is Robert Stephen Ford? This guy is very irrelevant to what's happening now. It says, this is from 2011. Remember the Arab Spring insurgency in Syria started in 2011. The reinstatement of a US ambassador in Damascus is Robert Stephen Ford reinstated in 2011 as the ambassador to Syria, American ambassador. But more specifically, the choice of Robert S. Ford as US ambassador bears a direct relationship to the onset of the protest movement in mid-March against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Robert S. Ford was the man for the job as number 2 at the US Embassy in Baghdad, 2004 to 2005, under the helm of Ambassador John D. Negroponte. He played a key role in implementing the Pentagon's Iraq-Salvador option. The latter consisted in supporting Iraqi death squadrons and paramilitary forces modelled on the experience of Central America. Now, John Negroponte has appeared in my books many times over the years. This man gives evil a bad name, gives pure evil a bad name, and was the orchestrator in Central America of death squads and mass murder and killing for the United States. And then he became ambassador of Iraq. I mean, when I saw that, whoa, here we go. What's going on here? And his number 2 was Robert S. Ford, involved in all that, and then he's moved across to be ambassador in Syria just before the trouble started with US supported, trained and armed rebels. This is the story of what's going on. You never hear it in the mainstream media, but this is the story. The Western media has misled public opinion on the nature of the Arab protest movement by failing to address the support provided by the US State Department, as well as US foundations, including the National Endowment for Democracy, to selected pro-US opposition groups. Known and documented, the US State Department has been funding opponents of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad since 2006. Exactly. That's where all this Arab Spring was in preparation. Says the protest movement in Syria was upheld by the media as part of the Arab Spring, presented to public opinion as a pro-democracy protest movement which spread spontaneously from Egypt and onwards. And the fact of the matter is that these various country initiatives were closely timed and coordinated. Absolutely right. There is reason to believe that events in Syria, however, were planned well in advance in coordination with the process of regime change in other Arab countries, including Egypt and Tunisia. The outbreak of the protest movement in the southern border city of Daraa was carefully timed to follow the events in Tunisia and Egypt. It's worth noting that the US embassy in various countries has played a central role in supporting opposition groups. In Egypt, for instance, the April 6 youth movement, very much involved in this fake Arab Spring in Egypt that led to military control, was supported directly by the US embassy in Cairo, and I've talked about that in my books, my earlier books. Interesting in this week where all this is happening is that there was the story of Jeremy Corbyn, who has just become the leader of the opposition Labour Party in Britain, and he's coming from a different direction to these psychopaths. Don't agree with everything he says, don't agree with everything he does, but, you know, breath of fresh air in so many ways. And the headline here is "Reality of British Empire should be taught in schools," he says. Because the British Empire is really the hidden hand empire. It's just a vehicle. And so what you had with the British Empire is you had people like, for instance, Cecil Rhodes, a Rothschild frontman, going into southern Africa and creating war and conflict between the tribes of South Africa, so that they basically fought each other and destroyed each other. And what he would do was this. He'd go to a tribe and he would say, they're going to do this to you. And then he would go to the other tribe and say, they're going to do this to you. And he'd say to them both, you want to get your retaliation in early, first, in effect. And he would create a conflict, a war between them. I've just described Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy of the 1970s. Same thing. And when one of these tribes was basically at the point of defeat, he would go to them and say, look, your only way of surviving is to come under the protection of the British Empire. And they would agree, because they thought they had no option in the circumstances. And then the British Empire with its military would come in and destroy the other tribe and take over everything. That's how it works. So what is happening? This is how the British Empire worked all along. So what's happening now with the American Empire in cohorts with the British, etc., in the Middle East is just exactly the same. The same techniques, everything. Continuation, just acquiring more and more. So Corbyn told young Labour supporters on Monday that the national curriculum should include lessons on how the British Empire expanded at the expense of people. Oh no, can't tell them that. It's the truth. Perhaps we should do a little bit more about how history is taught in our schools, said Corbyn, absolutely, who is a lifelong anti-imperialist and peace campaigner. He said that while the history of European expansion is important, there are two other things that need to be added to that. One is the expansion of one empire at the expense of people, where that empire is expanding. We need to get the story from the people where that empire is expanding rather than those who came there to take control of it. History is written by the winners, as they say. In July, Indian politician Shashi Tharoor made a passionate speech at the University of Oxford, claiming his country was entitled to financial compensation after centuries of exploitation and foreign rule. The video of Tharoor's speech was viewed by more than 1.5 million people on YouTube, and reported in the Indian press, which said Britain's rise, although this is what he said, Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. We paid for our own oppression. It's a bit rich to oppress, maim, kill, torture, and repress, and then celebrate democracy at the end of it. Eh? It's the same recurring story, right to present day. He further said Indians had paid for their own oppression by buying British goods, arguing that by the turn of the century they were the biggest buyers of British products in the world. And the British Empire is just a name given to a recurring hidden hand empire. We had the Babylonian Empire. The same bloodlines created the Roman Empire. The same bloodlines created the British Empire. The same bloodlines are behind the American Empire, and what they want is a global empire. That's what it's all about. And we had a situation this week where President Obama at the UN actually boasted of the success of the Libyan campaign, which takes both mendacity and, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say self-deception, but he must know he's lying, to new levels. President Obama's address to the United Nations on Monday presented an elaborate apology for his foreign policy, including something very few people would attempt to defend as a success: the overthrow of dictator Gaddafi in Libya. The president said this adventure should be viewed as an example of international cooperation. Yeah, let's all bomb them. Yeah, that's good cooperation. That staved off a massacre before modestly allowing that the aftermath was less than optimal. The president talked about learning the lessons of the past from interventions such as the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya. In Libya, Obama said the United States joined an international coalition under a UN mandate to prevent a slaughter. No, to cause a slaughter, the consequences of which are still going on. Even as we help the Libyan people to bring an end to the reign of a tyrant, Obama continued. What does that make Obama then? When did Gaddafi's Libya ever bomb the crap out of country after country? Our coalition could have and should have, he said, done more to fill a vacuum left behind. You have never had any intention of doing that. You never have. In such efforts, the United States will always play our part. And one final story this week, which is very much connected to this and the migration crisis and suppression of freedom of expression. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, officially runs Facebook. I don't believe it personally, but officially does. He's the front man for it. Mark Zuckerberg caught on hot mic saying Facebook will censor anti-migrant posts. This is how it all works. Media in cohorts with politics, both answering to the same hidden hand web. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg was caught discussing the censorship of anti-migrant posts at the United Nations Development Summit on Saturday, speaking with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. According to CNBC, the pair were caught on a hot mic after Merkel confronted Zuckerberg on social media posts critical of the wave of Syrian refugees entering Germany. She don't want opposition to be seen and have a voice to that, because her job, given to her by the web, is to fill Germany with enough migrants to change the nature of German society. For reasons I discussed in other videocasts and mentioned a few minutes ago. After being asked about Facebook's efforts to curtail speech, Zuckerberg stated, "We need to do some work," confirming he'd already started looking at ways to hinder comments in opposition to Merkel's immigration stance. "Are you working on this?" Merkel asked. "Yeah," Zuckerberg responded. "Cool," before their microphone was cut. In response to the shocking revelation, media outlets such as Bloomberg Web immediately leapt to the defense of the tech giant, insinuating that any critique of the German government's response to the migrant crisis would be racist and xenophobic. Yeah, as long as people working for Bloomberg don't have to cope with it, especially Michael Bloomberg, a former mayor of New York, goodness knows how many times, who owns the bloody thing. Only just last week, an article by InfoWars' Kit Daniels examining the Pope's controversial comments on mass migration or mass immigration was pulled and barred from Facebook without explanation. They've done it to me. They don't give you any explanation at all, because they're law unto themselves. All this kind of, yeah, Facebook, hey, Zuckerberg, hey, yeah, cool, are you cool with that? Cool. It's all a front. It's a vicious organization working for the gang, working for the web, created by the web. Since the migration crisis began, news outlets across the globe have both covered up crucial facts, specifically NATO's responsibility in destabilizing Syria, and gone out of their way to outright ignore any stories that highlight the criminal acts of migrants. All a mind game. Zuckerberg's penchant for censoring speech deemed politically incorrect is unsurprising, given his meeting late last year with Liu Wei, the Tsar of China's authoritarian internet censorship system, and that's what they want everywhere. So it's amazing when you start out talking about one thing, although the theme continues, how all these other things come out of it, because everything connects to everything else. It's all connected because ultimately the same source and the same force is behind it all. And that's what the mainstream media will never tell you. And that's why people like me do what we do. See you next week. Bye.